What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo team, talking some college football DFS. The Week 6 main slate, we're going to go through all of the games, break them down for you. But before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We will be bringing you behind the glass today to look at some of the tools we have at Awesemo, highlighting some player usage data. Of course, we have everything else from ownership projections, regular projections, slate write-ups, everything you need to dominate the college football DFS streets. But let's get right into this. Our first game we will talk about is Texas versus Oklahoma, the marquee rivalry game of the slate. It's a 3.5-point spread in favor of Oklahoma, a 63.5-point total overall. Both of these teams are about average in pace. Oklahoma has been much pass heavier than Texas. Texas actually has embraced the run more of late than to begin the year. But we'll start this on the Oklahoma side. You have Spencer Rattler declining in price. He has not shown the same ceiling that we saw last year from Rattler, but his efficiency metrics are relatively constant. He's averaging 250 yards per game, completing 76% of his balls for nearly 8 yards per attempt. He hasn't eclipsed 300 yards since week 1, but the ceiling's in there. We've seen it plenty of times last year and even in week 1 this year. With his price falling, he's worth considering in tournaments, especially at 8,300. I would like to stack him. The problem is there's just not really much clarity among receivers where to go. The wide receiver 1, at least by routes run, still looks like Jaden Hazelwood. He's the only player that's on the field for a full complement of snaps. Marvin Mims is still hovering about 50% of the routes. Even Michael Wood saw his route rate drop to 53% last week, with Mario Williams shooting up to 47%. Jeremiah Hall, Austin Stogner, Drake Stoops, even Braden Willis are all mixing in for snaps, making him really hard to stack. If you take this approach, I think you just take flyers on Hazelwood and Mims because they're not expensive, and you move on. In the run game, they still continue to split the work about 50-50 between Kennedy Brooks and Eric Gray. Brooks did outtouch Gray 14-6 in the last week. He's actually outgained him 315 to 245 on the year. But concerningly, Brooks still hasn't seen a target in the pass game. This does look like a 50-50 timeshare. Texas has been allowing a lot of production on the ground. They allow 172 yards per game. So taking stabs on these guys has been an approach we've done this year. We've done this with a lot of the high-powered teams. With Oklahoma, it hasn't worked yet, but still worthwhile. For Texas, Casey Thompson's been great since they changed starting signal callers, somewhat mobile with 115 yards on the ground. But Thompson, if they continue the run-heavy approach we saw last week, he is going to struggle for ceiling games just based on volume. He did not eclipse 300 yards in week 4, or he did eclipse 300 yards in week 4, but he hasn't been above 164 in either of his other 2 starts. So if they get ahead in the game, they're going to ride Bijan, which makes Thompson volatile, but he does have a ceiling if they get in shootouts, which Oklahoma has been in this year. So in GPPs, Thompson's okay. Easy to stack too. They use 3 wide receivers consistently. Jordan Whittington in the slot, Xavier Worthy, and Joshua Moore's your punt play if you're stacking Thompson. Bijan Robinson had 38 touches in their last game. And this looks like a recipe if Texas is playing close games from ahead. He's now averaging 23.2 per game, 130 on the ground purely, another 33 yards through the air. That's 160 cumulative yards. He's expensive, but he's worthwhile, even in a tougher matchup against Oklahoma's defense. The workload's just phenomenal. Game 2, we have Maryland taking on Ohio State, a massive total of 71 points. Maryland is a 21-point underdog. Both of these teams slightly below average in plays per game, but Ohio State has just made up that with efficiency, as we see with a lot of elite teams. Florida, Alabama, they're teams that make it up with efficiency. Maryland's been extremely pass-heavy. Ohio State is balanced. Maryland lost their best receiver, Dante Demas, which shifts the balance of their whole team. He was their best player overall. Talia Tagovailoa is a quarterback that struggles to throw downfield, but volume's been on his side. 35 attempts per game, 296 yards, somewhat mobile with 57 yards coming on the ground. I think he's viable in GPPs, but down Demas, it's going to be tough to play much Tagovailoa, even at a cheaper price. The one thing I will say, Raheem Jarrett at 4,100, his target volume is already pretty consistent, averaging 7.3 per game over the last 4 games. Now we remove a 20% target share from Demas, 500 receiving yards. Raheem Jarrett should just be fed the ball. And if you're looking for who steps up for Demas, Jayshon Jones to be a full-time player. Then you'll see Darryl Jones splitting to some degree with like Brian Cobbs. Chigo Conquo maybe takes a step forward, but I think you're focusing on Jarrett and Jayshon Jones. Very, very cheap, solid run backs to Ohio State stacks as well. They abandoned the run game when they got down to Iowa last week. Very, very much afraid of that against Ohio State here with Tayon Fleet Davis just 4 carries. think you ignore the Maryland rushing attack, especially at their prices. Ohio State, CJ Stroud, still probably too cheap at 9,500. He's not mobile, but the dude has an elite ceiling through the pass game, averaging 323 yards per game on 31 attempts. Luckily, he was back from injury last week. That's all positive. Maryland has been hemorrhaging points, especially through the air of late. They made Spencer Petras look like a Heisman candidate. Stroud is easy to stack. He has 3 clear options at different price points in Olave, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. Based on target share and receiving yards, Garrett Wilson should not be cheaper than Olave, so he's the clear preferred play. But Smith and Jigba has now seen at least 6 targets in 3 or 4 games. He has 349 yards. That's 70 yards per game. He's easy to stack too. And your pure punt play is Jeremy Ruckert. He'll be a value based on touchdown potential. Ohio State's pretty easy stack. They have a 46 implied team total. Play some Ohio State. Trevion Henderson got banged up, but it looks like his absence in the second half of last game was precautionary. He's now seen just 8 carries, in back-to-back games, but he's still averaging 100 yards per game. Just elite efficiency, way more efficient than Mayan Williams, Master Teague. We should see him up closer to the 22 carries that he had 3 games ago if health is not an issue. This will be a timeshare to some degree, but Henderson's just clearly been the most efficient back. I think you can play him. And if Henderson misses for whatever reason, Master Teague should see an uptick in volume. He's really cheap, which is something to at least monitor. Game 3, we have Michigan State taking on Rutgers, a much lower total here, 50.5 points, a 6-point spread in favor of the Spartans. It's a game where Michigan State has been able to embrace the run recently. They are 5-0. Rutgers just got dismantled by Ohio State, so their pass rate is up a little bit, but neither team is going to focus on the pass. Both teams play with some pace. Michigan State hasn't necessarily needed to because of non-competitive games, but they will at times. Peyton Thorne's been really efficient. He's averaging 245 yards on 26 attempts. That's fantastic. If the volume ever increases in a shootout, he has a clear ceiling. You're just not projecting to see that against a Rutgers team, which is going to run the ball quite a bit. So Peyton Thorne, a middling option. In the run game, Kenneth Walker has seen immense opportunity in really every game this year outside of their easy cupcake game where he just had 7 carries. Now, Kenneth Walker, extremely efficient, averaging 136 yards on the ground. He's not active in the pass game, which raises concerns if they were ever to trail. But Kenneth Walker still seeing immense carry volume and efficiency. Rutgers is a middling defense in the run game. Kenneth Walker is certainly viable. In the pass game, if, again, they ever get into competitive game scripts, they have a very narrow target distribution between Jalen Nailor, Jaden Reed. Nailor's seeing way more targets, a 32% target share to a 23% target share for Jaden Reed. But Reed is the big play guy. Both are GPP options here, but it's a less than desirable game environment. I will not be playing them outside of GPPs. Trey Mosley is the wide receiver 3. For Rutgers, Noah Vidral is a dual threat with a limited ceiling as a passer, just averaging 181 pass yards. Volume's never going to be there, and his dual threat ability isn't on the level of like a Malik Cunningham or even a Sam Howell. He just doesn't have enough upside at his price. Would rather play like a Tagovailoa. The run game is also, it's going to be difficult for Pacheco to stay relevant in games where they're down. Now, they're only 6-point underdogs here, but Pacheco has ceded some work to Kyle Monangai at times, Aaron Young, even Jameer Collins-Wright in the last game. I think that was more blowout than anything. He's only averaging 16.4 touches per game. Again, he's 4,500, so maybe worth a look here. Somewhat active in the pass game with 11 targets, but just a middling option overall. Bo Melton's been banged up in the receiving game, something to watch moving forward. He is their leader. Crookshank would take a step forward if Bo Melton is out. He would vacate a 25% target share. And then you would likely see Crookshank and Shameen Jones function as the wide receiver 1 and 2. Brandon Sanders splitting a little bit of time with Isaiah Washington. I still think it's Shameen Jones over Brandon Sanders. Not a great game to target for DFS. Game 4, Arkansas taking on Ole Miss. There's a lot of points projected here. 67, 6-point spread in favor of Ole Miss. Both of these teams were embarrassed last week. But Arkansas still is a 30.5 implied team total. KJ Jefferson, 6,900. Most of his usage is coming on the ground, 235 yards. He's a better dual threat than he is passer, not even completing 60% through the air and 18 attempts per game. That should rise against Ole Miss because we know this team can score. So Jefferson viable in GPPs, and he has a very clear preferred stacking option in Treylon Burks, 6,300, 37.5% target share. In pass-heavy scripts, this makes Burks a fantastic value. Their wide receiver 2 in recent weeks has actually become Tyson Morris. He's only has 9 targets on the year. He's the 4th most targeted receiver on the team, but he is 2nd in receiving yards. The big plays have led to more playing time, so Tyson Morris is your cheap stacking option if you want one. In the backfield, Traylon Smith continues to cede a lot of work to Raheem Sanders, Dominic Johnson, AJ Green. In his last 3 games, he only has 1 game with a carry count above 12, which is concerning. At 5,300 and an underdog, he's somewhat viable in the great game environment, but I think you'd rather just find bell cow backs than hit a Traylon Smith who's been risky. Matt Corral, he's very expensive on DK, averaging 304 pass yards per game, mostly coming via efficiency. Ole Miss is actually only passing about 42.5% of the time, but he's a solid dual threat as well, 161 yards on the ground. Corral is easily stackable. He's just expensive. I would rather play Stroud, but if you're getting to Corral stacks, you need to know Mingo is out, unfortunately. That means we're going to have to look a lot to Dontario Drummond, who's their target leader, 24.5% target share, receiving leader as well. Braylon Sanders is going to step up for a larger role. He saw 5 targets in their most game against Alabama, but he's the clear wide receiver too. And then they used Jaden Jackson as the direct backup, 5 targets for him as well, about a 62% route share. I was a little concerned with Dontario Drummond potentially moving outside and them using Ja'Cour Pearson in the slot. That did not happen. They continued to use Drummond in the slot, and they used the direct backup to Mingo, Jaden Jackson, as the wide receiver 3. So those are your top 3 options for Ole Miss. The backfield is a timeshare between Jerry Ely, Henry Parrish, and Snoop Connor. Jerry Ely's banged up, and he may miss the game. If he does, Henry Parrish becomes an elite play at 4,800. It would just condense the running back room to 2 players rather than 3. They are efficient. It's just very difficult to target one of them when it's a 3-way timeshare. None of them truly have a ceiling without multi-touchdowns, but if it's reduced to 2, Parrish would become a great option. Snoop Connor would be in play as well, but Parrish is the best pass catcher of the group. South Carolina taking on Tennessee. A middling game environment overall, 57 total. Tennessee is a 10.5-point favorite. South Carolina does not play fast. That's mainly because of inefficiency. They're balanced in pass rate. Tennessee is a Josh Heupel offense now, so they're playing at the speed of light. Passing at a 38% clip, that mainly comes because Hendon Hooker is a fantastic rusher, but they're going to play with pace either way. Luke Doty's been somewhat viable as a signal caller. He has negative rushing yards on the year. He's not going to be an elite dual threat, but he's more mobile than their other options, averaging 191 pass yards per game. Their receiving room is a disaster. Josh Vann is their wide receiver 1. Jalen Brooks, wide receiver 2. Dakarian Joyner, wide receiver 3. Vann is averaging 68 yards per game, but it's a really tough situation to target any South Carolina players at their prices. In the run game, Kevin Harris has slowly worked his way ahead of Marshawn Lloyd, Zaquandre Wright, Juju McDowell, but he still hasn't seen more than 16 carries in a game. His touch count is a 14.3 average. He's only averaging 35 yards on the ground. There's just better options than taking Kevin Harris as a 10.5-point underdog against Tennessee. On the other side, Hendon Hooker has been a fantastic dual threat. 7,900 is still not expensive enough for him in this game environment. They have a 34-point implied team total, 216 yards in 3 starts for Hooker. He is averaging 170 yards through the air. Just a lot of upside for him, both in the pass game and in the run game. He's a solid option at his price. And from there, in the run game, we have to watch Jabari Smalls. He exited right before halftime, did not return. If Smalls is out, it's going to lead to a larger workload for Tyon Evans. We've seen this before, and Tennessee has used Jalen Wright in a change of pace role. They're destined to use multiple backs no matter what it seems, but Tyon Evans was so efficient that he's earned himself a larger workload. 16 opportunities per game for him, just a little bit expensive at 6,900. The wide receiver room for Tennessee changed in their last game. Velus Jones, who had not eclipsed a 40% route share, I should say, jumped all the way up to a full-time player, saw 8 targets, had the big game. Wasn't expecting that based on previous performance, but Velus Jones has outperformed the other 3 wide receivers that were starting. So it makes sense that he saw an increase in playing time. 8 targets. He now has 14 targets combined in the last 2 games. He is usable in Tennessee stacks. So is Cedric Tillman. So is Javonte Payton. They are the other 2 full-time players in the offense, neither of whom has been targeted as much, neither of whom is averaging more than 35.5 receiving yards per game. But we're expecting more efficiency from Tennessee. They're cheaper plays, but Velus Jones is your clear wide receiver 1 in the offense right now. West Virginia, Baylor, a pretty bad game environment overall. 2.5-point spread in favor of Baylor, 44 total overall. Both teams really slow. West Virginia is pass heavy, but they're just struggling with so much efficiency. Jarrett Deggy is not playable right now. He was playable somewhat last year because their pass volume was much higher, but he's only averaging 31 attempts per game. His negative rushing yards really are they're a hindrance to him. If he can't throw for 300 yards, his negative rushing yards basically reduce his ceiling to a place where he's not playable. Baylor has a good defense, really low implied team total on both sides. You're not stacking him either, more than likely. The only two players seeing a full-time receiving workload are Winston Wright and Bryce Ford-Wheaton. Winston Wright is averaging 55.5 receiving yards per game at 5,600. That's not ideal. Ford-Wheaton is at 43.8. He's 4,500. Neither of whom are fantastic options, unless you think the game goes way over the total. The only player worth talking about is Letty Brown as a contrarian option in GPPs. Their offensive line has been bad, so he's only averaging 75.6 yards per game, but still averaging 20.6 opportunities. These backs that see heavy workloads and bad matchups are still worth mentioning for contrarian options in tournaments. So Letty Brown, only option on West Virginia. Baylor, you have Jerry Bohannon, who is a decent dual threat, but they're also passing at such a low rate that he simply doesn't have a ceiling. 23 attempts per game. I will say West Virginia is weaker against the pass, but Baylor has shown no ability or willingness to ride the pass when they're playing from ahead. So Bohannon, very low ceiling. Abram Smith is splitting 50-50 with Tristan Ebner despite being way more efficient. 501 yards on the ground for Smith, 335 for Ebner on a comparable workload. Ebner is more active in the pass game. He has 10 targets to Smith's 5, which keeps Ebner active and viable at 4,700. Smith, tough to trust with his efficiency at 6,200. There's just better options. If you think Baylor takes a pass-heavy approach for whatever reason, Tyquan Thornton has been their dominant receiver, 29.5% target share, but he's still only averaging 54 yards per game. That's because they're not throwing a lot. RJ Sneed actually has more receiving yards than him. He's averaging 64.5 per game, but he has 10 fewer targets. Thornton's the better play out of these two. And Drew Estrada has worked ahead of Josh Fleeks as the wide receiver 3 in recent weeks. 8 targets to Fleeks 1 last week. You just play Thornton if you're playing anyone on Baylor. Virginia, Louisville. Probably the premier game on the slate. 69.5 point total. 2.5 point spread in favor of Louisville. Both teams playing extremely fast football. Virginia is way above expectation in pass rate, 64.5%. Louisville about average, 48. Brennan Armstrong has been one of the premier quarterbacks in the country. He is mobile. He's averaging 391 pass yards per game. And the mobility isn't exactly reflected in his stats right now, but he is a guy that had 552 rushing yards on the ground last year, which makes him one of the elite options among quarterbacks. They don't run the ball a lot, but Wayne Talapapa and Mike Hollins had 11 and 10 carries. They would need to get in the box multiple times to hit value. Talapapa is averaging 32 yards per game. Mike Hollins, 23. In the pass game, there's plenty of stacking options. Jelani Woods has hurt their tight end. His status was not updated this week, but last week he was in a boot. I think that does not bode well for his status. But if active, Jelani Woods is in play. From there, you have Billy Kemp and Dontavian Wicks as the wide receiver 1 and 2. Wicks is your big play downfield threat guy. Billy Kemp is more of an underneath slot receiver who is more targeted than Wicks, but both are fantastic plays. Keaton Thompson, former quarterback and gadget receivers, playing with a cast on his hand, but it did not hinder him whatsoever last week. 9 targets, 3 carries in the run game, still too cheap at 4,600. And then Rashawn Henry, still playing a full complement of snaps. He's averaging 7.3 targets per game in the last 4 games. He just has not had a big game yet, but 7.3 targets per game at 3,300 is absurd. Expect him to be the most popular punt play on the slate. Louisville, Malik Cunningham's expensive, but he's been a fantastic dual threat, 9,500. Would still rather play Stroud, but 309 yards on the ground for him. They have been playing with a ton of pace, so he's still averaging 260 through the air. Cunningham, you can play him naked, you can stack him, you can play him however you want. In the run game, Jalen Mitchell, he's ceding so much work to Malik Cunningham that he's difficult to trust himself, just 16.6 opportunities. But 4,600 for Mitchell in a game with a 69.5 total, and they're 2.5 point favorites. He should be firmly in play as well based on his opportunity in this potential game. In the receiving room, Braden Smith got hurt, vacating snaps. They're still using Marshawn Ford, their tight end, as their wide receiver 1. He's leading the team in targets and receiving yards. Jordan Watkins has been the second most consistent player for this Louisville team. And from there, they actually reduced the snap share of Justin Marshall. His route rate dropped from 92% to 48% last week. That was with Josh Johnson, Tyler Harrell, even Amari Huggins-Bruce mixing into the game. So expect mostly Marshawn Ford and Jordan Watkins to be your consistent receivers here. It'll be a timeshare the rest of the way. Boise State taking on BYU, 57-point total. 2 very different teams. BYU, 5.5 point favorite, moving up to 6 in some spots. Boise's very fast, very pass-heavy. They have a porous defense. BYU is slow and methodical, and they're much run-heavier than last year, switching from Zach Wilson to dual-threat Jaron Hall. On the Boise State side, Hank Bachmeier is not mobile, but he is benefiting from a poorer defense. It's elevating his attempts to 37 per game. allowing him to exceed expectations through the air, averaging 302 pass yards. He's a stacking option worth targeting here. In the run game, George Halani got hurt again. He aggravated the injury that was causing him to sit out games to begin the year. Status was not updated, but I would be surprised to see him play. They have no good options in the run game outside of him. Cyrus Habibi-Lukoyo, the Oregon transfer, Andrew Van Buren have been among the least efficient running backs in the country. The one thing Habibi-Lukoyo falls back on is his pass game usage. He has 15 targets on the year, but still there's better players. I'd rather play Jalen Mitchell than Habibi-Lukoyo. In the receiving game, Khalil Shakir is somewhat taken a step back lately. Only 15 targets combined in the last 2 games, but he's still easily pacing the team with 43, 25% target share, averaging over 100 yards still. Better days are ahead for Shakir. He's still worth targeting here. Stephen Cobb's return from his injury immediately popped up for 11 targets in a big game. He's still the number 2 receiver in terms of yardage, despite missing 2 games and the large part of another one. Octavius Evans is the seldom used wide receiver 3. I think you're either playing Shakir or Cobb's. Otherwise, punting with Octavius Evans doesn't make a lot of sense. There's better players in that range. For BYU, Jaron Hall is not a great signal caller as far as passing, averaging just 187 yards per game. Part of that because of game script, but still with 28.3 attempts per game, he's not been efficient through the air. He's only completing 60% of his passes for 6.6 yards per attempt. But what Hall does do really well is use his legs. He's an excellent dual threat with 166 yards already on the ground, averaging 7 yards per carry nearly. You can play Hall as a GPP option in this good game environment. Boise is very bad on the ground, which benefits Hall. In the run game, Tyler Algier has moved ahead of Lopini Katoa clearly. He's now averaging 22 opportunities per game, 115 yards on the ground alone. Algier is expensive, but he takes advantage of a poor Boise defense on the ground. In the pass game, Neil Paiu is the wide receiver 2, despite being the number 1 in targets. Gunnar Romney missed a large part of week 1, so he's been more active of late. Gunnar Romney, 6 targets per game in the last 4 to Neil Pau's 5.3. Romney also more efficient through the air. They're very close in price, but trying to get to Romney if possible. Puka Nahua is the wide receiver 3. He's been active, but averaging only 4.3 targets per game. Tough to get to anyone outside of Pau and Romney, and now a run-heavy BYU offense. Next game, we have Wake Forest taking on Syracuse. This game is a 5.5-point spread in favor of Wake Forest, a 57.5 point total. Wake Forest plays incredibly fast, the exact opposite of Syracuse, who has changed quarterbacks and moved forward with a very methodical, run-heavy, slow offense. Wake Forest is extremely sensitive to game script. Last game, we saw their pass rate shoot way up in a competitive spot. It was 48.5%. And again, they're throwing the ball 42% of the time on the year because of competition. That gives Sam Hartman some upside. He does have good dual threat ability, 117 yards on the ground, 257 yards through the air per game. That's solid efficiency. So if he ever does see uptick in pass rate or plays per game, he could be a main beneficiary. Worth stacking here, but this might not be the game against, again, a slow, methodical Syracuse team. On the ground, it's a 3-way timeshare. They somewhat moved Christian Turner out of the timeshare, only 5 carries to Justice Allison's 15, Christian Beal-Smith's 11. Beal-Smith has been the most efficient, and he's averaging the most touches per game. If you're playing one of them, for me, it's Beal-Smith or going all the way down to punt with Turner at 3,300, but I don't think you necessarily need to with some other solid punt receivers. In the receiving game, Jackery Roberson finally moved ahead of A.T. Perry in targets and receiving yards. He's the wide receiver 1 in negative game script, I should say, positive game environments. Extremely efficient for Roberson. A.T. Perry's been a solid wide receiver 2, though, 5,400 for him. Both are usable in stacks with Hartman. The wide receiver 3, Taylor Moore, and also worth mentioning, had 8 targets last game. He's now been above 7 targets in 2 of his last 4. Overall, I think you're playing those 3. Stewart and Keyshawn Williams are rotating. For Syracuse, they switched quarterbacks over to Garrett Schrader. He is mainly going to be a rushing QB. He had over 100 yards in their last game, 234 and 2 starts already this year. But he doesn't have any pass game volume whatsoever. So you're basically taking one of your quarterback spots and playing a glorified running back there, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I won't be playing much Schrader. In the run game, Sean Tucker has been fantastic. Regardless of game script, they're giving him an immense workload. 23.8 touches per game. He's extremely active in the pass game. He has 11 targets for another 170 yards there. Tucker is a phenomenal option. Taj Harris transferred. That leaves Anthony Queeley, Courtney Jackson, and Sherrod Johnson as the top 3 receivers. None are seeing elite target volume, but I think you want to focus on Queeley and Jackson if you do play the Schrader stack. Not something I would recommend. The worst game on the slate, maybe. I mean, There's 2 games back-to-back now we'll talk about that are pretty bad. Wisconsin, Illinois, 42-point total. The Badgers, 10-point favorites. This is moving to 11 in some spots. Illinois is very bad against the pass. Unfortunately, Wisconsin does not do that. Wisconsin's plays per game are elevated way above expectation because of a 90-play game against Penn State. They're going to be below average to average in plays per game. Their pass rate never going to be elite. And when they play with leads, it's going to be well below 40%. Graham Mertz is entering this game banged up, which does not help their chances of passing more. He's been one of the worst quarterbacks in football, not playable at his price. Negative rushing yards are just way too hard for him to overcome. The backfield's now a timeshare. They were giving Ches Malusi the Jonathan Taylor workload early in the year, but they involve Jalen Berger. They involve freshman Braylon Allen, who's been their best back, actually, and their coaching staff talked about getting Braylon Allen more work this week. So I don't think you can play any of the runners. And then the receivers, they are going to be hurt by the run-heavy game scripts when Wisconsin plays for ahead. So Kendrick Pryor, Danny Davis, Jakes Ferguson, all too expensive to play here. On Illinois, this team has a 16-point implied team total. Sitkowski's not even completing 50% of his passes. You can't play him. The running backs, it's basically been a timeshare between Josh McCray and Chase Brown. Illinois has been wildly inconsistent with their runners this year, but Brown has been the most efficient. He should play the most, but McCray is involved as well. Tough to target either in this game. Wisconsin has a phenomenal run defense. And again, Illinois is not passing a lot. When they do, it's with little efficiency. Isaiah Washington's the only one worth considering with his 27 target share, not even averaging 46 receiving yards. Just a bad game overall. Penn State, Iowa was much the same, a 40.5-point total. Penn State, 1.5-point underdog. Their implied team total is 19.5, despite being a fairly up-tempo, pass-heavy offense. Sean Clifford's a good dual threat, averaging 267 yards per game, but this is arguably Penn State's toughest matchup this year. If you're stacking Clifford, which doesn't seem to be a wise idea, you're playing in with Jahan Dotson. He's expensive, but he has a 30% target share, averaging 89 yards per game. Parker Washington, Keandre Lambert-Smith are the wide receiver 2 and 3, averaging 6.5 and 4.8 targets per game over the last 4. The running backs have become a nasty timeshare. Noah Cain is banged up, so he's been ceding work to Kevon Lee and Baylor transfer John Lovett. A 3-way timeshare against a strong Iowa front 7, not something to target here. On the Iowa side, Spencer Petras had the best game of his career, 2 rushing touchdowns despite finishing with negative rushing yards on the day. He's not worth targeting in any matchup based on low upside as a passer and inability to run. Stacking him is near impossible in a low-volume pass attack, but Sam Laporta is the wide receiver 1, even though he plays tight end, averaging only 53 yards per game, really low upside against a strong Penn State defense. Tyler Goodson's really the only playable piece in the entire game, averaging 22.8 touches per game, 86 yards on the ground. Iowa has 4 new offensive linemen, so they have not been efficient, and I would not expect that to increase against Penn State. So even he is a middling play in GPPs. Georgia-Auburn to close this out, 46.5 total, another middling option here. Georgia's a 15.5-point favorite, so they have an implied total of 31 points. JT Daniels is tentatively expected back. Watch pregame for this, but Georgia's just been running over opponents, and they probably will not use Daniels much or Stetson Bennett, whoever starts. So that's not a huge key to the slate for me. It's a 4-way timeshare between Zamir White, Kendall Milton, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. One of them can pop up for a big game at any point in time, but good luck predicting who it's going to be. The leading receivers, tight end Brock Bowers, he's really the only mainstay in the offense. They project to get back Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, Arian Smith, Darnell Washington, and Dominic Blaylock very soon. Some of them likely will return in this game. That makes players like Adonai Mitchell, Jermaine Burton, even Kearis Jackson, all really tough to trust. So even though Georgia has a good total, probably not playing any of them just based on uncertainty. Bo Nix played well in their last game, Auburn's last game against LSU, but most of that came on the ground. He only completed 60% of his passes in typical Bo Nix fashion. This is the toughest matchup he's played all year. Not worth targeting anyone on Auburn. Tank Bigsby has allegedly been banged up, only averaging 16.4 opportunities. They do not have a clear wide receiver 1, but the 4 guys on the field the most are Shedrick Jackson, Kobe Hudson, Demetrius Robertson, and tight end John Samuel Schenker. Not playing anyone for Auburn with their 15.5 implied team total. We also have the FanDuel main slate. We are not going to get into this on the stream, but if you want to check it out, all the games are here. Florida State, North Carolina, your marquee night games like Michigan, Nebraska, Notre Dame, Virginia Tech. But otherwise, that is the main slate. If you guys have questions, leave them in the comment section. Let me know your favorite play. Would love to hear it. Otherwise, we will be back with live before locks before all of the main slates this week, the Friday slate, the Saturday slate. I am Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you again next time.